June 11, 1944. A signals room on the island of Tinian, in the northern Marianas chain. Vice Admiral Kakuta, commander of the 1st Air Fleet, has been at the teletype since before dawn, reading damage reports that do not match the plan he filed with Tokyo 3 weeks earlier. The first American fighter sweep arrived in the hours before sunrise. By the time full light reached the ocean horizon, Japanese aircraft had been destroyed on the ground at a Slido field on Saipan. By 9 in the morning, strike reports were coming in from Guam, 90 miles to the south, where ground crews had been pulling aircraft from revetments when the Hellcats crossed the airfield perimeter. By noon, a third wave was working over Tinian itself, less than 4 miles from the room where Kakuta stood. 3 islands. The same task force. One morning, he had promised Admiral Soma Toyota, the new commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, 500 land-based aircraft held in reserve for the moment the American carriers came within range. These aircraft were the first phase of the plan the Japanese called AGO, the decisive fleet engagement that was supposed to end the American carrier offensive before it reached the home islands. They were supposed to bleed Task Force 58, to strip its combat air patrol and degrade its striking power before Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet closed for the killing blow. Kakuta was holding them. The problem was that by the afternoon of June 11th, most of them were burning, and the ones that had gotten airborne had not come back. If this story is pulling you in, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who's listening. The plan that required those aircraft had been built on an understanding of American carrier operations that was accurate for 1942 and had not been meaningfully updated since. The Japanese naval staff had read the record carefully, and the record made a consistent argument. At Coral Sea in May of 1942, both carrier forces had maneuvered against a single operational objective over the course of days. At Midway, the American carriers had struck one concentrated target. Through the months of attritional fighting in the Solomons, American carrier groups had advanced, taken damage or risked it, and withdrawn to Noumea or Pearl Harbor for repair, sometimes leaving the Marines on Henderson Field without air cover for weeks at a time. The pattern held from one operation to the next. American carriers were capable, but sequential. They struck one target, recovered, rearmed, and moved to the next. The Japanese planning staff had built its defensive doctrine around that rhythm, around the gap between one American strike and the next, around the window in which land-based air could concentrate and strike back. The Guadalcanal campaign had reinforced this reading in ways that specific officers at the combined fleet had formally noted. Through the autumn and early winter of 1942 and in 1943, the air war over the Solomons had been conducted as an extended exchange in which the Americans had repeatedly pulled their carrier groups back from sustained engagement with land-based air. The carriers Saratoga, Enterprise, and Hornet had all been damaged or lost in the campaign. The surviving American carriers had not returned to the contest immediately. They had withdrawn for repair, and during the intervals of their absence, the Japanese land-based air at Rabaul had operated against Henderson Field without the overhead threat of American carrier fighters. The combined fleet had drawn a specific lesson. A carrier force under sustained pressure from land-based air had to manage its exposure carefully. Attrition conducted against it with enough patience and enough aircraft would force the Americans to step back, and that step back was the moment the decisive battle doctrine had been designed to exploit. The lesson was sound. The carrier force the Japanese had drawn it from no longer existed in the form the lesson assumed. That reading of American capability had been embedded in Japanese operational planning for 2 full years. Senior officers at the combined fleet had read every available intelligence report on American shipbuilding and carrier aviation, and they had concluded that the Americans were building more of what they already had, operating in the same pattern at the same predictable tempo. The decisive battle doctrine, which the Imperial Japanese Navy had been refining across 2 decades for precisely this eventuality, could still work against numerical inferiority if the conditions were managed correctly. You used land-based air to absorb the first American strikes and reduce the carrier complement. You brought the main fleet forward when the Americans were degraded. You fought the engagement the doctrine required. The plan Toyota approved in early May of 1944, after assuming command of the combined fleet following the death of Admiral Manichi Koga in a flying boat crash over the Philippines, was called AGO. The decisive battle would be fought in the Philippine Sea, where the geography of the Marianas and the range of Kakuta's land-based air would create the conditions Japanese doctrine demanded. A conference of staffs was held at Tinian between the 8th and the 11th of May, bringing together the planning teams of Toyota, Ozawa, and Kakuta to coordinate the operation. At that conference, the authorized strength of the 1st Air Fleet was placed at 500 aircraft across the Marianas and Carolines. Kakuta's force would conduct the attrition phase. Ozawa's mobile fleet, waiting at Taitai in the southern Philippines with 9 carriers and more than 400 aircraft, would deliver the finishing blow. Every element of the plan depended on the land-based air being operational when the battle opened. Kakuta had said it would be. He had also been concealing, across the preceding weeks of American carrier raids against his airfields, the actual state of his garrison. Vice Admiral Ozawa, in his post-war interrogation by American officers, would confirm that the land-based planes under 1st Air Fleet totaled about 500, and that this was the number on which AGO had been built. What the interrogation record also showed was that the number had been eroded by repeated American strikes through the spring of 1944, and that the commanders who depended on it had not been given accurate returns. Kakuta was not falsifying reports out of malice. He was managing information in the way of an officer who understands that an honest damage assessment might cause a plan that senior command has approved to be revised, and who is not certain the revision would be an improvement. The result was that Toyota and Ozawa were making their calculations against a land-based air strength that existed on paper, but not in practice. The Japanese naval aviation training system had compounded the problem in ways the May conference had acknowledged, but not solved. The carrier aviation groups of the Kakuji, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had been destroyed along with their ships at Midway in June of 1942. The pilots in those groups had trained for years in peacetime, accumulating the kind of operational experience that only comes from sustained time in the air against realistic opposition. Their replacements had been pushed through a pipeline that the naval staff understood was inadequate. Replacement pilots entering the 1st Air Fleet in the spring of 1944 were flying with roughly 1/4 of the training hours their opponents would carry into the same engagements. Some had as little as 3 months of total flying time. They had learned to take off, navigate, and land. They had not yet developed the absorbed instincts that distinguished a pilot who could fight from one who could only fly, and that difference, against what was approaching from the east, was not a manageable deficit. The root of that deficit ran back to Midway. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the war with a carrier aviation force built across a decade, trained at standards that had no peacetime parallel among the major naval powers, and hardened by the China conflict and the opening Pacific campaigns. The men flying from the Kakuji and Kaga in December of 1941 were not products of a wartime pipeline. They were professionals whose understanding of carrier warfare had been accumulated through years of sustained instruction and operational repetition. What Midway destroyed was not just those men, but the institutional knowledge they carried, the absorbed understanding of how carrier aviation worked under pressure, which could only pass from experienced pilots to developing ones through shared time in the air against realistic opposition. The replacement program that followed was honest in its own internal evaluations about what it was producing. Officers writing assessments of pilot readiness through 1943 and into the spring of 1944 consistently documented the gap between what pilots arriving at operational units could do and what those units needed. The assessments circulated. The plan went forward on the authorized strength numbers, which did not reflect the capability gap the assessments described. Task Force 58 under Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher was not a larger version of the American carrier force the combined fleet had been studying and planning against since 1942. It was a different instrument. Photographs of Mitscher from his carrier command years show a lean, spare figure with a long-billed cap and the economy of manner common to men who have been doing demanding things for a long time without needing to explain themselves. He had been flying naval aircraft since 1916. He had commanded carriers through the Guadalcanal campaign and had spent the months since then directing operations from the Gilberts to the Marshalls to truck with a methodical accumulation of combat experience and a growing understanding of what the force under his command could be made to do. By June of 1944, that understanding had been translated into 4 carrier task groups capable of simultaneous operations across a front hundreds of miles wide. 9 Essex-class fleet carriers had been commissioned since late 1942. Each carried 90 aircraft, more than any Japanese carrier except the Taiho. 7 light carriers operated alongside them. The Grumman F6F Hellcat, which equipped most of the fighter complement, had been designed from captured Zero data. In June of 1942, a Zero-Sen force down on Akutan Island in Alaska had been recovered largely intact, repaired, and test-flown by American engineers. The findings went directly into the Hellcat specifications. The aircraft was heavier than the Zero and faster in a dive, protected by armor around the cockpit and self-sealing fuel tanks, and powered by an engine that maintained its output at the altitudes where the Zero's performance fell off. An American pilot in a bad position in a Hellcat had options the Zero pilot in the same position did not. The gap between the two aircraft was one of the specific things that AGO had not fully accounted for. Supporting the entire force was a logistics system that Japanese operational planning had consistently modeled and consistently underweight. The United States Pacific Fleet maintained a fleet train of oilers, ammunition ships, and supply vessels capable of servicing Task Force 58 at sea, without requiring the carriers to withdraw to a fixed anchorage between operations. This meant 4 independent task groups could conduct simultaneous strikes on separate objectives and sustain those operations without the recovery cycle the Japanese had built AGO around. A carrier force that could refuel and rearm at sea was not the same operational problem as a carrier force that came and went in predictable cycles. AGO had been designed for the predictable version. What arrived over the Marianas on June 11th was not predictable in the way the plan had required. On June 11th, 208 Hellcats, guided by 8 torpedo planes acting as pathfinders, launched in coordinated sweeps against Saipan, Tinian, and Guam before and after sunrise. All 4 carrier task groups contributed aircraft. At a Slido field on Saipan, Japanese aircraft were still being moved when the first fighters crossed the perimeter. The ones that managed to launch climbed into a fight where they were outnumbered, slower at altitude, and in the hands of men with a fraction of their opponent's accumulated flying time. Over Guam, the story repeated. Over Tinian, the same. American pilots claimed 86 kills in the air and 33 destroyed on the ground across the sweep. The first day of Operation Forger had not yet reached its noon hour, and the land-based air umbrella that AGO required had already ceased to exist as a functional offensive force. The Japanese aircraft that did get airborne over the Marianas that morning fought with what their training had given them. The accounts of American pilots who flew the sweep record opponents who pressed attacks despite the disparity in numbers and in equipment, men who did not simply turn back because the odds were against them. Engagements developed over Saipan and over Guam, in which individual Japanese pilots closed on American formations and accepted the consequences. Some American aircraft were shot down. The record does not support the notion that Japanese pilots refused to contest the sweep. What the record does not show is any engagement in which the tactical situation shifted in favor of the defenders in a sustained way. The Hellcats had the altitude performance and the speed at combat heights to disengage and reposition before the next pass. The Zeros, when they reached a favorable position, found their opponents already gone. The battle over the Marianas on June 11th was not a rout of men who would not fight. It was a rout of men who fought inside a structural disadvantage, at the level of aircraft performance and accumulated pilot skill, that individual courage could not overcome. The ratio matters less than the operational consequence. Task Force 58 had executed simultaneous strikes against 3 separate islands and emerged with its combat strength intact. Kakuta's first air fleet had been reduced, in the span of a single morning, from the force on which the entire AGO plan had been constructed to a collection of survivors sheltering on auxiliary fields or grounded for lack of fuel and serviceable aircraft. The 500 aircraft promised to Toyota for the attrition phase of the decisive battle were gone before the decisive battle had been scheduled. The reports Kakuta sent to Tokyo that day and in the days that followed did not say this. He reported engagement results that described a land-based air campaign still capable of executing AGO. The picture Toyota received in the Japanese home islands and the picture Ozawa received at sea were consistent with the plan proceeding. Both men made their decisions on that basis. Toyota issued the order to execute AGO. Ozawa, with the mobile fleet at Taitai, sortied north on, or about June 10th, and fueled at Guimaras Strait before proceeding east toward the Philippine Sea. On June 13th, the American submarine Redfin reported the mobile fleet's departure. On the 18th, the American submarine Albacore found Ozawa's flagship, the fleet carrier Taiho, and put a torpedo into her hull at 9 in the morning. Gasoline spread through the hangar deck. By approximately 11 o'clock, the vapors reached an ignition source. The explosion destroyed the ship. Ozawa transferred his flag to the carrier Zuikaku by destroyer and continued north. He was still advancing on Kakuta's picture of the air situation in the Marianas. He had no reason not to be. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications. There's far more in the record still to cover. Your support is what keeps these stories coming. The air battle that followed on June 19th over the Philippine Sea confirmed in a single day what the strikes of June 11th had already made probable. Japanese carrier air groups, flying without the land-based air support their commander believed he had, without the experience their opponents had accumulated over 2 years of Pacific operations, and an aircraft whose design had not kept pace with what they were flying against, launched 4 waves at Task Force 58 and lost the air war in an afternoon. More than 300 Japanese carrier aircraft were destroyed. 3 Japanese carriers were sunk, Taiho and Shokaku on the 19th, Hyo on the 20th, when American carrier aircraft found the retreating fleet. Ozawa had brought 450 aircraft into the engagement. Very few returned. The battle has been entered into the historical record under the name American pilots gave it, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The name accurately describes the ratio. What it does not fully convey is that the ratio had been predetermined 8 days earlier over 3 islands. A specific element of what went wrong on June 19th deserves its own account, because it shows the gap between the plan and the reality in a way that the casualty figures alone do not capture. Ozawa's tactical concept for the engagement had included a shuttle element, in which his carrier aircraft would not simply strike Task Force 58 and return. They would fly past the American carriers, strike them, continue on to the Japanese-held airfields at Guam and Tinian to rearm and refuel, and then launch a second strike on the way back to the fleet. This would multiply the effective range of his air groups and allow a sustained attritional attack that his carrier fuel and ordnance loads alone could not support. The concept was rational given the plan. The airfields at Guam were supposed to be serviceable staging bases because Kakuta's reports had described a garrison still in control of its facilities. When the first wave aircraft reached Guam on June 19th, they found American carrier aircraft over the airfields. The shuttle, which was supposed to be the tactical multiplier of AGO, deposited exhausted pilots into a combat zone they had believed to be a staging area. Ozawa learned the accurate condition of the Guam airfields only after the battle was over. In the autumn of 1945, teams of American analysts from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey conducted interrogations of surviving Japanese flag and general officers in the weeks and months following the surrender. The sessions were held in Tokyo and ran across hundreds of interviews. Vice Admiral Ozawa was interrogated on October 16, 1945, in Tokyo, by Rear Admiral R.A. Ofstie of the United States Navy, with additional officers present. The records of that session are part of the survey archive, available to researchers, and they read differently from any official Japanese account of the operation. Ozawa was direct. The war was over. There was nothing left to protect by managing the record. He confirmed the basics of AGO without hesitation. He confirmed that the land-based planes under Kakuta's first air fleet totaled about 500, and that this number was the foundation on which his own commitment to the engagement had rested. He confirmed that the first air fleet was under the direct command of Admiral Toyota, not under Ozawa's own command, and that the coordination between the two forces had been Toyota's responsibility. He said the training of his carrier air groups when he left Tai was very insufficient, and he attributed this specifically to the fact that the airfield at Tai had still been under construction during the fleet's stay there, preventing flight operations. He described the plan as having been built on the coordination of land-based and carrier air. He described what the coordination had actually produced, which was 4 waves of aircraft sent against Task Force 58, with very few returning. He said he received no report from Toyota directly as a result of the first day's action, and that during the battle itself, he received no accurate information about American damage from the waves he had launched. He was describing, in the flat professional language of an officer no longer managing appearances, the specific mechanisms by which a plan had met reality and come apart. What Ozawa did not say in that session is as significant as what he said. He did not dispute the premise of AGO. He did not argue that the plan had been wrong as a concept. He said that the land-based air force on which the plan depended had not performed as expected, and that he had not had the means to verify its state before committing the mobile fleet. He was not making excuses. He was making an accurate technical observation about the structure of the plan and the information environment in which it had been executed. The land-based air was supposed to do one thing. It had not done it. Everything that followed was a consequence of that failure meeting the force that was already coming. The session also touched on something Ozawa's wartime dispatches had never addressed directly: the specific state of his carrier air groups before the battle. He said training had been limited by the Tai period, during which the airfield remained under construction and flight operations were constrained. He said all the pilots could land on deck in daylight. He said this without framing it as an alibi. He was describing the condition of his force at the moment it was committed to an engagement from which very few of his aircraft returned. The pattern that emerges across the survey's Japanese naval interrogations, read as a collection rather than a series of individual sessions, is more specific and more candid than anything in the wartime official dispatches. Officers who had spent years calibrating their communications to what superiors in government needed to hear were no longer doing that. What they described, in various registers across multiple sessions, was the gap between the war they had planned for and the one that arrived. The combined fleet had built AGO on an accurate assessment of American carrier operations as of the early Pacific War. The American carrier force of June 1944 was not the carrier force of the early Pacific War. It operated at a scale, a tempo, and in an organizational pattern that the AGO planning had not modeled, because modeling it accurately would have required acknowledging that the plan's foundational assumptions were obsolete. That acknowledgement had not been made. The plan had gone forward on its premises, and the premises had met June 11th. There is a passage in the Ozawa interrogation that captures the distance between the two things the survey record contains. Asked about his basic plans for defense against American landings in the Marianas, Ozawa described the coordinated land-based and carrier air concept with precision and without hesitation. He explained the 500 aircraft allocation, the coordination structure under Toyota, the role Kakuta's force was supposed to play. He described the plan as though it were still a reasonable plan, because as a plan it had been reasonable. Then, in the same session, he was asked what his air groups had actually accomplished on June 19th. He said very few planes returned. He said he received no accurate report of American damage during the battle. The two answers sit in the same transcript, separated by a few exchanges, and what sits between them is the entire distance between the war the combined fleet had designed and the one that arrived. The mechanism behind that outcome was traceable to decisions made years before the battle. The Essex-class carrier program had been authorized by Congress in June of 1940, before the attack on Pearl Harbor, and had been running through American shipyards for 4 full years. 9 ships were in the Pacific by June of 1944. Each one carried 90 aircraft. Each one was supported by a logistics chain built specifically to keep the force operational at sea without returning to a fixed base. The underway replenishment system, which allowed Task Force 58's oilers and ammunition ships to service the carriers while still at sea, was the specific capability that made simultaneous multi-island operations possible over sustained periods. A carrier force that did not have to return to port after every major operation could not be predicted in the same way as one that did. The Japanese planning system had built AGO around the predictable version. American aircraft production supported the same structural advantage at the level of the individual machine. The Grumman factory was delivering Hellcats at rates the Japanese aircraft industry, running under strategic bombing pressure and material shortages, could not approach. Each American aircraft, rolling off the production line, was functionally identical to the one before it. Japanese aircraft in the field that developed mechanical problems required improvised maintenance with parts that were often unavailable. American aircraft in the same condition were more likely to be replaced than repaired. The accumulation of that difference, across hundreds of aircraft and months of operations, was a structural gap no tactical adjustment could bridge. Gunter Rao, the third highest-scoring fighter pilot in aviation history, said something similar about the P-51 in a different theater in a different year. He was talking about oil seals and electric starter motors. The physics of industrial war are not romantic, but they are consistent across both theaters and both enemies. The islands themselves fell in the sequence the clearing of the airfields had made probable. Saipan was secured on July 9th. Tinian fell on August 1st. Guam's major combat ended on August 10th. The construction battalions that followed the Marine and Army units onto those islands rebuilt and extended the existing airfields into the longest operational runways in the Pacific. The Boeing B-29 superfortresses that eventually flew from Tinian to strike the Japanese home islands had not yet been built on June 11, 1944. They were built and they flew because the runways were cleared, and the runways were clear because 208 Hellcats arrived over 3 islands simultaneously on a single morning, and the plan that was supposed to prevent them had already failed before they crossed the horizon. The interrogation record of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey was deposited in the National Archives and has been available to researchers for decades. It is not widely read outside specialist circles, which is one reason the assessments it contains have not entered the standard account of the Pacific War as fully as the battles themselves. What those assessments say, across multiple sessions and multiple officers, is not what the official wartime dispatches said. The admirals who sat across from American interrogators and occupied Tokyo in the autumn of 1945 had stopped managing the record. They were making accurate technical observations about the distance between the war they had designed and the war they had fought. Ego had been built on the Americans of 1942. The Americans of 1944 were a different force in kind, not just in scale, and the distance between the two had been closed in American shipyards and training fields while the combined fleet was preparing a plan to fight what no longer existed. The men who admitted this in those rooms were not confessing failure. They were describing, with professional precision, the specific shape of how a rational plan had been overtaken by a reality it had not kept pace with. 3 islands. The same task force. One morning, Kakuta's 500 aircraft were burning in the revetments before Ozawa had put to sea. The plan for the decisive battle was a casualty before it was a battle, and the small, weathered man with the long-billed cap on the flag bridge of his carrier had not yet received the complete returns from the morning, because the morning still had work to do. Thank you for staying with this until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen carry the story forward. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one.